Yeah, decision making is a mess, to be honest. Most people make poor decisions. They don't know why they're making the decision they make. Yeah, we need we need in our businesses and society and government, we need ways of challenging decisions that are safer, because power in particular, power does three things to the brain. This is some new research for us. The first one is it has you think of people as objects and not as human, and they're objects for your goals. So ways of helping you achieve things, and so you literally dehumanize people when you experience more power, and you think of people as concepts rather than people. The second thing is you don't accurately assess risk. When you experience power, it gives you a little bit of a high, in a sense, a feeling of control, more autonomy, more certainty, more status. All these things are very rewarding, intrinsically rewarding. And in that reward state of feeling higher than others, of feeling more certain, of feeling in control, in that reward state, we often poorly assess risk. We poorly assess threat. The opposite is true. When we're feeling threatened, we poorly assess opportunity. That's the safety bias, right? But in an experience of power, we don't assess risk, and so we will gloss over something that is actually risky because we won't feel like it's a risk. And someone with lower power will look at that situation and say, well, that's really dangerous. The third is interesting. When you experience power, you lift up to higher levels of abstraction or construal. You're not thinking about exactly how a person uses the product. You're thinking about the strategy for selling that product. You're thinking conceptually, right, not tactically. And so you're lifting up to higher and higher levels of what's called construal. And construal is like abstraction and conceptuality. And so these three factors together, people, risk, and details, these three factors together make you make some poor decisions that end up being biased. You'll make some interesting decisions. So we need a way of challenging people in power that is still respectful, but respects the fact that they can miss things, and leaders miss things all the time. And I hate to be political, but the decision by the US to invade Iraq back then was based on incredibly biased information, and was, in hindsight, an incredibly poor decision for everyone involved. And in hindsight, you can see all the bad decisions that were made that were all based on bias, mostly a safety bias in that case. And so the piece we wrote about, it's a well-known phenomenon, the two-challenge rule. If you challenge someone once and they don't hear something, you challenge someone twice, and there has to be some recognition of that challenge if you're called on twice on something. And that's a protocol, just like putting a mask on in an operating theater. That's a protocol to address the fact that biology can get in the way of good decisions. In this case, the biology is power, and that sense of power can have you literally not perceive a risk, not perceive that you're cutting someone open and about to miss an important fact. And so the power can have us make bad decisions. So in that situation, yeah, we need to accept protocols. Now, boards are supposed to keep executives responsible. Boards are supposed to keep executives doing the right things. And we've tried to build in that structure, but I think we need more language around how those boards interact with leaders to get the dynamic just right. I think the challenge with the kinds of decisions executives make is they contain a lot of information and a lot of uncertainty. There's many variables that are unknown. And there's also a lot at stake. If you get the decision wrong, you can lose a career, or lose your whole livelihood, or just destroy lives in many ways. So there's a lot at stake. So there's going to be all of those things together actually shut down the brain. So having too much to think about, having a lot at stake, having a lot of uncertainty. These things are overwhelming to the brain. So rather than thinking really, really well, these kinds of pressures will actually reduce quality thinking and force people to have more reflex actions. So if you're not encouraging a more deliberate process, you'll have people reflexively responding or automatically responding without thinking deeply, without using their unconscious, without checking for bias. So we need these protocols and processes, particularly for executives, because the kind of more senior you are in an organization, the harder it is to think well about these tough calls. Yeah, decision making is not much of a science anyway in the hands of everyday people and executives. There is no common language or common methodology or common techniques for good decision making, and you need to understand that the majority of decision making happens very unconsciously, and we don't take that into account. We think that decision making is a very rational process, but the rational resources in the brain are extremely limited compared to the unconscious brain. I mean, in our conscious brain, people will freak out if you tell them to add up 4 digits. You say, add up 56 and 79 in your head, and they'll say, "Oh, I can't do that." It's decisions. It's a few simple steps. 56 plus 79. You picture it. You move these numbers around in your head. It's a series of steps. There's only a few steps, and there's only 4 bits of data in there, but people freak out at literally adding up 4 digits. And so we don't respect that we are doing literally trillions of times more complex decisions every second unconsciously. And so we've only really built decision-making models for the conscious brain without taking into account the unconscious. In fact, the math that explains the difference is helpful. If you were to imagine the conscious brain as the coins in your pocket, then the unconscious brain is the entire European economy of all European countries, in one single person. So it's just hugely more important to understand the unconscious. Now, there are 2 really big things to understand about the unconscious that are slightly connected. One is that the unconscious is much smarter than the conscious, and the other is that the unconscious is also incredibly biased, so maybe not so smart. So the unconscious keeps you standing up and avoiding traffic, and keeps your calcium levels correct and your heart beating, and it's very smart, very smart. And when you're trying to solve a problem, you want your unconscious to go to work on that problem. You need your unconscious to solve the problem, and so we need models that value the unconscious processing, and part of that is insight, and part of that is just so allowing insights to happen and respecting insight, and part of it is just respecting the way the unconscious processes. So that's a big piece of it. We can dig more into that. And then the second side, which I've been doing a lot of work on the last 5 years, is around bias, unconscious bias. And it's a terrible problem, and we while it's good to listen to our unconscious, we also have to check that our decisions are not just biased, because actually they almost always are. But are they adaptive biases or maladaptive biases? Are they biases that are good, or are they biases that are blinding us to important data? So we've been working on both those topics for a while, and particularly in the last 5 years, we're now doing a lot of work around mitigating bias or reducing bias in organizations, working with about 80 of the world's largest organizations, in fact, on this question in a consulting capacity, as well as significant research. So I'm happy to dig into both of those topics. It's a complex question. If you're in a domain a domain of knowledge that you know a lot about, and it's relatively a relatively fixed domain, like art or music or and you know, you're an expert in that domain, then it's true that your immediate responses will tend to be very intelligent because your unconscious is coming through. So that's true. Your unconscious is much more powerful than your conscious. So the concept of, you know, unconsciously recognizing quality or unconsciously recognizing a flaw. You know, if you know a lot about a domain, unconsciously recognizing something wrong, you know, you're tapping into huge pattern recognition machinery. That can be very powerful. If it's a domain that you don't know much about, then you're probably more likely to be exhibiting a bias. You know, your snap decision is probably going to be, you know, more either guesswork or you're connecting to something from your past. So it's kind of complicated. I mean, the blink concept is true in domains that, you know, you're really deeply steeped in, but at the same time, you still have to check for bias. You still have to make sure that you're not motivated by some external factor. We think that there are three foundational ideas that people should take into account in all decision making and problem solving and collaboration and all aspects of interaction, really. There are three main bodies of knowledge that matter, and we think of this as capacity, motivation, and bias. And capacity is how much information that you can hold at once. It's cognitive load theory. It's how do we process. So we need to respect capacity issues. Motivation is we need to respect what people are drawn to and what they stay away from, which is the SCARF model. So motivation is about what are people intrinsically drawn to and drawn to stay away from. What are people trying to avoid in particular. And I'll dig more into that. And then the third one is bias. So we think capacity, motivation, and bias are the three kind of cornerstones of better understanding of how the brain works. On the motivation side, on SCARF, it's very interesting. We published SCARF in 2008. So it stood the test of time. It's still a very powerful framework. It describes, SCARF describes the 5 things that the brain automatically and mostly unconsciously is drawn to or drawn away from. And it stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And in particular, the brain is avoiding the negative of these. So negative status is like when you feel like you might be looking stupid. Negative certainty is when you're feeling more and more uncertain or unsure in a situation. Negative autonomy is when you feel like someone else is in control of you and you're losing control in some way. Negative relatedness is when you feel like you're with people you don't trust and you're not sure if you trust someone. Right? And negative fairness is when you think you're not being treated fairly. So in particular, the negative response is very strong, more strong than the positive response. And we are driven to avoid looking bad, to avoid feeling uncertain, to avoid feeling out of control. And so we structure our lives and our conversations and our interactions and our work to minimize SCARF threats or SCARF dangers and maximize SCARF rewards. So we try very hard to not look bad and to look good, to not feel uncertain and to feel certain, etc. And so these are motivating our decisions all the time, mostly unconsciously. These are big motivators for us. But capacity is also a big motivator. We're drawn to make decisions just because they're easier. We're drawn to make decisions because we can think about them. Decisions that are harder to think about, we just avoid, and we make easier decisions because of basic processing ability. And so the way we're motivated is very important to understand in decision making, but also just the way we process the world is significant too. The brain is perfectly built for decision making. It's just that for millions of years we did the same things. We didn't have new decisions. It's perfectly built for the environment it evolved in. I think the plow in the fields of Europe didn't change whatsoever for 400 years. The design of the plow in the Middle Ages, like perfectly built for these times. So our brain is perfectly built for quite stable times where we don't need to make a lot of new decisions. And actually we have exceptional good skills for reading social cues, for detecting if someone is a friend or foe, for detecting if someone is being fair with us or not. We have very finely attuned unconscious decision making for reading the social fabric around us, for reading how people are with each other and with ourselves. Mostly this is unconscious, but we have huge resources for that. We have huge resources for keeping us alive. It's just the resources for holding a lot of complex information in mind and imagining future scenarios. We just never had to do that to any great extent for a long time. So we have very good ability to do that, but nothing like our social acuity or our spatial acuity. So the brain has just evolved through history to be very good at specific tasks that are necessary to our survival. Complex decision making now, you'd say, is that necessary to our survival? Well, it's very helpful to our thriving, but it's still not necessarily. You can survive without being great at complex decision making. Certain people will thrive because they're much better at that, but I wouldn't say it's necessary for everyday survival right now. Bias is just another way of saying being automatic or assumptions, generalizations, categorizations. Bias is something that's essential to the brain, and it's not a good or bad thing. It's there constantly. We are constantly unconsciously grouping and categorizing and organizing information to be able to survive. The issue is, particularly in the business world, when you're making a decision that has long-term consequences, you don't want to be missing certain information. You don't want to be accidentally unconsciously biased and hiring the executive that just went to the same school as you because they feel better, right? Rather than hiring the best executive. Like writing a check for a project that's the same as the last check that you wrote because that worked out well without doing all the math of how much does this project really need. We don't want to be accidentally biased when decisions have a long tail. And certainly at the executive level, a lot of decisions have a long tail. They affect a lot of people, a lot of money. So we don't want to be accidentally biased. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with going back to the same restaurant every week to eat. If you like the people and you like the comfort, no one's being hurt there. But going back to the same vendor, for years and years and years because you happen to like them and not necessarily getting the best product or the best price, that's not so good. And so there's a difference between actions that have no harm and actions that actually could have harm. So you'll always be biased. The question is, when does it matter or not? And so we think about what are the decisions that are under the threshold, like where should I go for lunch? Maybe on the threshold, like who should I take for lunch? And above the threshold, like should I buy this restaurant chain? Right? There are decisions that are clearly above the threshold where bias could matter. And so we're just helping executives understand that when a decision is above the threshold, you should check that the bias is not maladaptive. Maybe it's good bias, maybe it's bad bias. You should think about it. Don't just buy the restaurant chain because you've been eating there a long time. If you're in the electronics business. If you're in the food business, you've got to know the restaurant, you see some good things about it, maybe buy it. But be careful of biases that creep in. Go back to the hospital room. We want to be thorough when operating on people because of biology. Well, when operating on businesses, we also should be thorough because of biology. Biology has us make poor decisions without aware that we're doing it. And we need protocols, just like masks, to make sure that these poor decisions don't affect ourselves and our families and our lives and our businesses the wrong way. Yeah, so a lot of the work on unconscious bias is making sure you don't make a maladaptive decision, that you don't make a bad decision. That's an interesting question. It's got me thinking. It is actually helpful in organizations as you're working in a team or working on a project. It's actually helpful to study success, not just study failure. But the way the brain works is that failure or danger or threat or problem or loss, these things jump out more. They seem more important than winning. It's like, oh, we won, so we don't need to debrief on that. We won that client, we won that pitch, so we don't need to talk about it. Or we lost the pitch, well, we need to talk about it. And this is just a tendency that comes from this stronger weighting towards loss in the brain. But actually, there are many learnings from when we win. And so we don't tend to, in society, we don't tend to study our wins. We don't tend to study what has gone well when we win a client or an investment goes well or these kinds of things. But it is important. And I think that should be a practice in all teams and all organizations. We should be practicing the after-action review of winning just as much as when we don't. What do we discover? We don't have a framework for that. But I would say what we discover when we win is sometimes we get lucky. Sometimes we notice. Sometimes we notice signals well. Sometimes we sense make very well. So sense making is a kind of intuition which is very much a non-conscious processing. So we're making sense of subtle signals and kind of making connections between things. I think as you look back, partly you'll notice early sense making. I think you'll look back and notice people just getting lucky. You'll notice people also being very, very thorough. You'll notice people being extremely thorough with their calculations, and I think that will happen as well. There's no specific study, especially in the last few years. There's no specific study that I've seen that really changed the game. I think for me, the big insight I had was that just how much of our decision making is just feeling. There's a book called On Being Certain by Robert, it'll come to me in a moment, there's my unconscious brain, Burton, Bob Burton, B-U-R-T-O-N. It's called On Being Certain or On Feeling Certain. There you go, that's ironic. But he talks about this feeling of certainty and how it arises and how it evolves and how false it is. And that so many of our decisions just come from just trying to find this feeling of certainty. And once we find it, we act. But it's just wrong so much of the time. And just, I think for me, it's just going back to the difference between the conscious brain and the non-conscious. And just recognizing that I really need help when I'm making a big decision. That I can't rely on my feeling of certainty. I can't rely on my feeling of confidence when I'm making a big decision. Can I rely on my feeling of confidence when I'm deciding where to go for lunch? Sure, it doesn't matter. But if I'm deciding on the next strategy for my business or a brand for a major initiative to impact 100,000 people, I need other people's brains. I can't rely on just my own brain. So I think that's been the biggest thing. And I guess an adjunct to that is the power of diverse perspectives, the power of really different ways of seeing the world, all coming to the same decision. And the research shows that diverse teams are much smarter, although they don't feel like that. They feel like harder work. But a really diverse team actually thinks much better and feels much worse all at the same time. So that insight is an important one. So probably those are probably the two biggest ones that really are affecting me. Yeah, it's interesting. I've always been fascinated by flying, and I fly a lot like everyone else. But I had an opportunity to fly a small plane a few years ago and really enjoyed, just for a few minutes, I really enjoyed the experience of actually feeling in control of the plane and understanding turbulence and understanding everything. It made me feel safer flying in big planes. It made me feel better about flying overall. And it was fascinating. And I guess learning to fly was so out of the realm of what I thought was possible for me. I just never imagined, I could do that. But the more I thought about it, the more kind of interesting it became. And partly, and other pilots have said the same thing, partly what's very interesting is it builds it builds disciplines, because you kind of have to, because your life depends on, you build all these disciplines. And in some ways, I have a very creative brain as a writer and researcher. And in some ways, I also as a leader, as I lift above all the kind of detail work that has to happen, it can be easy to lose disciplines and become unfocused. So I see it as a way of actually building really thoughtful day-to-day practices into my work, into being more focused. So it's actually helping me focus and helping me be much more disciplined in a lot of things, strangely enough. Certainly when your life depends on something, you really focus, and then you're building the ability to focus. These devices are teaching us to be really unfocused. They're teaching us to keep many things in mind and go between looking around and then looking at Facebook, and then looking around and then listening to music, and then looking around and then taking a photo, and then putting it on Facebook and then adding music. And it's teaching us to be really unfocused. And I wanted something to balance that forced focus. I tell my daughters that they've got to keep doing difficult things that require focus, so their brains don't lose the ability to focus. And so it's partly about that, discipline and focus. And I'm really enjoying learning about it, and discovering how much I don't know. I feel right at the beginning, which is terrifying and exciting. But it's great to have a whole new domain of knowledge to learn about. Oh, I never answered your question before about a really difficult decision. I would crowdsource a really difficult decision these days. And for my own personal life, whenever I've had any big personal decisions to make, I've always crowdsourced them and found that very helpful. So asked like 20 people, what would they do in this situation? So, and there is very good research that other people know us better than we know ourselves. That other people know our abilities and skills and potential better than we know. So yeah, I would ask lots of other people, not one or two because you'll get biased, but 10, 20 other people, what's the right thing to do in this situation, and then really reflect deeply on what their point of view is.